This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Done. Okay. So first of all, I'd also like to say how happy I am to be here and to thank you for the invitation to come to another workshop. So I've been conducting research since 2008 on Cape Verdean student mothers in northern Portugal. Sort of on and off, doing fieldwork on and off since 2008, still conducting now, and it's led me to look at a number of things. I've become very interested in most of these students that I've followed had no intention of becoming pregnant, so the focus of my research has been very much unexpected pregnancy. So I've been looking at issues of sexuality and gender, trying to understand this sort of conundrum of because there are many students that get pregnant. Looking at issues of care, sustainability as well. How do the students sort of help each other and support each other? Looking at issues of the law. How does the law impact upon their lives as students and as student mothers in Portugal? Some medical anthropology as well. A lot of my research has been accompanying the women in their medical appointments while they were pregnant and also after their babies were born. And but my sort of main theoretical interest has always been identity, looking at issues of self-awareness and identity. And so it was quite difficult to decide what to talk about for this workshop. But in the end, I decided to try and take on the challenge of the idea of the workshop, which is trying to see what links can there be between literature and social sciences. And obviously I haven't produced a paper where I'm referring to literature, but so I thought I'd focus more on the issues of self-awareness and identity, and then trying to make some links. But I'm actually going to read the paper. I do apologize for that, but I just feel otherwise I may run out of time. So that was just to give an introduction, and now I'll try and not bore you by reading. So, just to give some context then, Cape Verde is an archipelago situated off the west coast of Africa, which gained political independence from Portugal in 1975. So its poor natural resource base and arid climate have contributed to the island's long history of migration, which dates back to the colonial period and continues to the present day. Remittances from migrants constitute an important source of income for the local population, which is approximately 500,000. So it's a small population. And I think the population outside of Cape Verde is now estimated to be larger than the resident population. Now, young people constitute more than 50% of the population. 54.4% of the population are under 25 years old, and 70.4% are under 35 years old. And 25% of the population between 15 and 24 years old are unemployed. Now, unemployed in Cape Verde it's almost like a category. You know, I mean, there are lots of people trying to live off the land, but as I say, with the very arid climate, Cape Verde has also depended a lot on foreign aid. So migration in large numbers to Portugal began in the 1960s as a response to demand for labour by construction companies, which were deprived of Portuguese workers who had emigrated to non-Western Europe. Now, with the tightening of migration policies in Europe, legal migration has now become far more difficult. And many of the students that come particularly to study in the vocational training colleges, many of them are actually really coming to migrate, and it's the way that they can legally come into the country. And that would be a whole new paper, which is really quite fascinating and quite disturbing, which is the way in which the Portuguese training colleges are short on students, and therefore they encourage the students to come. And the students who come from Cape Verde are entitled to subsidies from the European Union, but they are entitled to subsidies presuming that they are resident. And so they're not resident, but they come, and then now they're resident. And so what this means is that the subsidies are actually very, very low, and it's actually very difficult for them to live off these very small subsidies, and that's not always very clear to the families who just understand, oh, you know, you'll have a grant, you'll have a subsidy. Well, I for many years thought it was a grant, and then realised, no, this is a subsidy, and there is a difference. So just to say there that, you know, there are, especially the vocational colleges, which is what I've been looking at most, there are lots of sort of financial difficulties for the students who come over, and so many of them then try to work, to try and complement their subsidies, and they often are very poorly paid and precarious conditions, etc. Now, unexpected student pregnancy, which is the focus of this presentation, it constitutes a concern for the families back at home, because they fear that motherhood will interfere with, if not terminate, their studies. Now, in Cape Verde, adolescent pregnancy is also very common, and in 2001 the government passed a measure which was to temporarily suspend pregnant pupils from secondary school, which was quite problematic and quite contentious. And then and now it's up to each school to decide, but there is still that possibility that if you're pregnant, you're not allowed to go to school. The idea that it would then serve as a deterrent. Now, the female candidates who came to study in Portugal for these vocational colleges were also actually obliged to take pregnancy tests by the local councils. The local councils have made agreements with the schools, and if they were found to be pregnant, they were not allowed to come. So there was a case of at least one student I know of, and I'm sure there were more, who knew they were pregnant but managed to cover it up. Others who the pregnancy test failed, but then because it was too soon, but then discovered they were pregnant, and others became pregnant while they were in Portugal. So unexpected pregnancy poses a number of challenges for the students. Finding affordable and appropriate accommodation for themselves is difficult because often they live together. As I say, they don't have a lot of money, and then crammed conditions with a small baby as well makes it much more difficult. The issues of their visas, as I've said, timely registration of their babies, renewal of their visas in order to avoid substantial fines, learning how to navigate the social welfare system, securing affordable and flexible childcare to be able to continue their studies. This is a big issue. Learning how to manage time effectively in order to be able to reconcile study with childcare, learning how to care for their babies in the face of contradictory advice from nurses, doctors and their own families back at home. So what I like to argue is that student migrant motherhood constitutes a period of heightened reflexivity, which is further intensified by living away from home, where everything, self, body, society, is called into question. And what I want to do in this presentation is to examine the voices of Cape Verdean migrant mothers in Portugal in the light of Margaret Archer's theory on the inner dialogue. And so this is trying to understand their thought process, because that thought process is in the light of her theory. And I think this is interesting, particularly for this context, because of the links this can give with literature. So just very quickly, a bit of context. Research which, this is Margaret Archer's sort of arguments here really, research which engages with subjects at a personal level faces the challenge of how to reconcile intimate engagement with the academic distance required for making contextual sense of the data. If on the one hand, the external gaze risks distortion and betrayal, on the other hand, complete submersion into the subject's phenomenology risks only telling half of the story. So how to get the balance between understanding the sort of wider structural influences and also the person's individual interpretations. Either we grant too much significance to society and not enough to the self, or focus excessively on the self without paying enough attention to society. And Margaret Archer says that the challenge is to join the two halves of these stories together in such a way that neither the subjectivity of individuals nor the influences of wider structures dictate the analysis. And Archer believes this is possible through the mediating role of the inner conversation. And she says that the inner conversation has a mediating role between structure and agency. So she argues that structures do not impact directly upon agents. This would be determinism. Rather, they are reflexively mediated via each individual's subjective concerns. So structures affect situations so that they may operate as either constraints or enablements. We often like to see structures as being simply constraints, but as we've just seen in the conclusions here, they also produce enablements, new possibilities, in relation to the concerns of agents, which are subjectively defined through exercising their powers to reflect upon their world and their place within it. So her argument is that the inner conversation, this ability to reflect upon structures and the way that they impact upon individuals, is where we can get this sort of balanced view between the individual and structures. She says the agent refers to our involuntary placement on society's scarce distribution of resources, so it may be disfavoured or more privileged. So to be born in the Philippines or to be born in Cape Verde, you know, that's where you happen to be born. That's your role as an agent. That's where you're put on society's scarce distribution of resources. It is a collective social identity we inherit from birth, since we do not choose the conditions that we are born into, that we share with other agents, which influence but do not determine the role we occupy as actors. Now, the actors' individuals' concerns are often in conflict with each other, again, linking in with the ideas that we've just heard about ambivalence. So attention to one may hamper the realization of others, and so decisions have to be made, separating primary from secondary concerns. This decision-making process takes place in the inner conversation. An archer's main concern is to investigate how the subject reflects upon his or her agential placement in the social order. So the I may be distressed to learn that its me is considered to speak with the wrong accent, to be of a disfavoured colour or gender, and that nothing that I can immediately do will change matters. As a reflexive monitor, the I may squirm inwardly to distance itself from the disfavoured me. Whether it can eventually do so will depend upon interpersonal and societal factors. This was a quote from Archer. Now, a number of the mothers felt that they were of a disfavoured colour. One mother, for example, who was applying for limited places on a course, believed that because she was black, her chances were not very high. Another, whom I accompanied in meetings with state officials to renew expired visas, believed that if a white woman accompanied her, she would be treated better. The uncertainty experienced by young Cape Verdean women faced with an unplanned pregnancy while studying in Portugal provides a rich source, really, for looking at how this inner conversation works. And it's not a passive looking into an essential self. It's an active process of the I speaking to itself by alternating as subject and object. So the pivotal process through which projects for the future self, the you, are articulated but also conditioned by the past self, the me. So let's consider the following statement made to me by a mother while we chatted regarding her experience of unexpected pregnancy. I cried a lot during pregnancy because it wasn't what I had expected. Then I asked myself, where is that strong, motivated, talented Isabel? Talented, I repeated, smiling. It's true. I was never easily satisfied. I was ambitious. I helped other people when they were in difficult situations. But when the situation happened to me, I became immobile. I couldn't control everything that I was doing. So here we see an example of the I speaking to itself, Isabel objectifying herself and asking after the past self that she once knew herself to be. So what I want to argue is that conducting interviews provides a window into the nature of the actor's inner conversations by engaging women in a dialogue that reflects with hindsight upon their lives. The sentiments of self-empowerment that came through in many of the interviews echo the words of the poor single women in the United States, that study by Edin and Kefalis, who claim that motherhood had matured them and brought more meaning to their lives. So here are two quotes. At first I felt insecure. Am I ready for this? Will I be able to rise to the occasion? I was full of fear. Now 1,000 wonders. I don't feel it was a mistake and I don't feel limited. Another mother, in some ways it was good because if I hadn't had this child, if I hadn't gone through everything I went through, perhaps I wouldn't be where I am today. My life was worse. It wasn't better as it is now. When I didn't have a child, my life was just college, clubbing and those kind of things. Before I didn't go to college, I didn't care about exams. So there's very much this sense by the mothers that it's given them a renewed sense of responsibility. This quote from a mother called Jasmine. So even her professors had noted the changes in her behaviour. But often the women's internal processes of self-realisation were not so evident to the health professionals and social workers whom I met when I accompanied them in their appointments. The social and political legitimacy of the young Cape Verdean women's pregnancies were contested in bureaucratic encounters, where their claims upon the state obliged them to constantly have to keep retelling their stories and justifying, and also, you know, being treated as irresponsible, and, you know, why did you get pregnant? Why didn't you take contraception? And there's one case, it was, oh, so you decided not to abort, a social worker says to a sort of 6-month woman pregnant, which, you know, she didn't even reply. It was like, well, no, because this is another issue, because abortion is only, it's only, how long have I got? Because I stopped reading in the end. Okay, because abortion's, only recently been legalised in Portugal. So this is quite interesting, that because it's now a sort of, the woman's right has finally been legalised, if you like, there's now this sort of opposite approach, which is almost putting pressure, particularly on Cape Verdean young student women, to abort. Oh, you can't afford to have a baby, and although many do send their babies back. To Cape Verde to be looked after their parents, and I would add that they don't have, many of them do not have the means of families in Cape Verde to have this media contact. So it is, it depends. So just to give an example of the way in which reproduction is linked with a country's national identity is evident, for example, in a Portuguese national newspaper, just to give a sense of how they are seen, entitled "The percentage of underweight babies at birth continues to rise." So immigrant women are singled out, and women of African origin in particular, for genetic reasons, as one of the major causes of this tendency, described in the article as a health indicator which is getting worse and transmits a negative image of the country at an international level. So the article identifies the Algarve as the region with more immigrants. So here there's this sort of implicit message that there's a hierarchy of genetics, you know, which places the reproductive lives of African women at the bottom of the ladder. Now I wanted to give a particular example of a rare opportunity that I had, in a sense, to witness and share in the ongoing spontaneous twists and turns of a young woman's inner conversation regarding how a suspected pregnancy would impact upon her social status and her identity. And the reason why I find it so interesting is because it is ridden with contradiction. So it expresses the imperative to abort whilst at the same time affirming that she is against abortion. Now this happened when I was planning to interview a mother, and then a friend of hers came to visit, and as we sat at the kitchen table we started chatting, and then I sort of jokingly said to this friend, you know, maybe one day you'll also enter my study. I used to do this as a joke with the Cape Verdean students, you know, maybe, because it did happen. I met students, and then a year later it was like, oh, I'm pregnant. And so and then what was so interesting was when I said this sort of sparked off a passionate response, because in fact she feared that she may be pregnant. And so we almost had a kind of almost monologue with her, and so just to give a sense of what she was saying, you know, I can't afford to have a baby. I'm a student, I'm poor. To have a child I have to give it everything. Imagine my child asking me to buy this and that and me not being able to afford it. I'm desperate. I'm going to have an abortion. If I have the baby, my grandmother will die. My parents will separate. I'm a catechist. Everybody's going to talk about me. They help me in the church. The landlady's a very religious person. What will she say? Nobody will believe it. My father didn't want me to come and study because he said, you mustn't go because you will become pregnant. That is what happens because you have no one to guide you. My mum said, no, she won't do that. She's sensible. I told my mother I would finish my course first and then come back to Cape Verde with a baby, and my studies completed at the age of 25. That is what I told her. I'm desperate. I'm going to have an abortion. I'm against abortion. I told a friend of mine who became pregnant in Lisbon that if she had an abortion, I wouldn't speak to her again. I said, if you have one, you can forget it because you're killing an innocent being. Now look, I'm now thinking of having one. I'm ashamed to talk to her. But if I were to become pregnant in Cape Verde, I'll be out on the street so as not to feel the shame. Last year my sister became pregnant and she had to go and live with her boyfriend's parents. She works so hard, she's doing the washing up, the clothes of the household. If I'm pregnant, I've already lost my mother, my father, my brother, just like that. I'm not going to Cape Verde. I'm going to have an abortion. I can't have this child. No. If my mother had an abortion, I wouldn't be here now. I love babies. Holding them in my arms, looking after them. You know, if I do keep the baby, I'll keep it just for me. I'll bring it up. I'll look after it on my own. His father, he's just a child. He's no good for this. He's 18 years old. He's very childish. He won't accept it. He just likes his music and things. And so this kind of went on, this constant, you know, I'm going to abort. I have to abort. I I love children, but I can't abort them. And so this provides a window into how the wider structures condition her decision-making processes. Now, the idea that she must be able to provide everything for her future child corroborates sort of research on Cape Verde, that respectable motherhood in Cape Verde is primarily seen as being a good nurture in an economic sense, being able to provide economically for your child. One more minute, okay. We also see how the I of Anna's personal identity reflects upon the consequences of being pregnant for her social identity in Portugal and in Cape Verde. So we see how it causes her to reevaluate her priorities and values and to call into question her default narrative of the self. There was a point when she's saying, me with a baby? Who? What am I? So I wanted to go on a bit more. So basically, Anna's general attitude towards abortion was shaped by previous experiences of seeing the world. Her response to abortion was called into question through an embodied experience of suspecting that she may have accidentally become pregnant. So the inner dialogue is not looking inwards, but rather looking outwards into the world. And just to conclude, conducting interviews and chatting in less formal contexts granted me privileged access to women's inner thoughts, in the same way that literature offers privileged access inside characters' heads. This kind of privileged access helps to understand the contradictions that often emerge when the practices of social actors or characters in novels do not correspond to what they say. Now, this is not an argument in favour of blurring the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction, but rather of searching for the connecting points referred to by Tonkin in her discussion of oral history, where she claims that personal identity, social identity, processes of identification and historical representations are so intertwined. Self-awareness is an important connecting point of anthropology, history and literary analysis. Since both the social sciences and humanities elucidate issues related to the human condition, there is an argument for conceiving of research that, instead of only looking inwards at its own discipline, also looks outwards to engage in interdisciplinary conversations with the world.